Hi again, class. This is our third and final part of the lecture today. And this is where we left off last time, slide 50. We're ready to move on to the next one. Okay, and next thing we do is we look at layouts using absolute positioning. Absolute positioning is something that we can use to create multi-column web pages. An advantage is that the order of the sections in the HTML document is not as critical as it is in the float method, because the divs can be positioned absolutely anywhere. The disadvantage is that you run the risk of elements overlapping and some of the content being obscured. This makes it problematical to implement full width elements below columns, such as the footer, because it will get overlapped if a position column above it grows too long. Let's take a look at an example. This one here is two columns with a narrow footer using the absolute positioning method and a liquid layout. The example you're seeing in this slide creates a right sidebar column which contains the links and the news using absolute positioning. Okay, as for the markup, nothing special. We've already seen it. We create a header, we create the main, the extras, the footer, and all of the styling takes place inside CSS. Assume that the header element has a height of 70 pixels plus 30 pixels of padding. That's 100 pixels in total. The style sheet that we are seeing here positions absolutely the extras div element against the right side of the page and 100 pixels down from the top to leave some room for the header element. The main content div is given a right margin wide enough to leave a space for the newly positioned extras sidebar. Okay, from what you can see here, know that the header is exactly 100 pixels tall, 70 pixels height plus 30 pixels of padding top and bottom. Okay, so if I only provide one value, you know it's for the top and the bottom part. Down here for the main section, the 30% right margin leaves space for the extras column. That is 25% of the page plus 5% space between the columns. Oops. And then down at the bottom in the extras section, the extras div is positioned absolutely 0 pixels from the right edge of the browser and exactly 100 pixels down from the top. The footer and the body, you can see on the next page, on the next slide, the margins are applied to the main content, are also applied here to the footer div, as you can see, and this is to prevent the footer from being overlapped by a long sidebar. Let's take a look at the result as expected. One more example. This one here is 3 columns with a narrow footer using the absolute positioning method and a liquid layout. In this particular template, both sidebar columns are absolutely positioned and the margins are applied to both sides of the main content to make way for the sidebars. The markup, once again, nothing special here. We simply contained the section container, create the section containers for the header, the main, the links, the news, and the footer. Because absolute positioning is not order dependent, the main div can appear in its preferable position. In other words, first in the HTML document. Only the links and the news div elements are positioned absolutely in this layout. Let's take a look at the style sheet. The style sheet is essentially the same as that for the previous example, with the exception that margins are applied to both sides of the main and the footer div elements to make room for the columns on both sides. The links and the news divs are positioned against the left and the right edges of the browser window. Technically, it is their containing block, respectively. And the width of the positioned columns is narrower than the margins on the main content div to allow space between the columns. Okay, so here's your header. It is 100 pixels. We got 70 pixels plus the 2 sets of padding. Remember, this is top and bottom, so the total equals 100 pixels. Then we make room for the left and the right sidebars. This is your margins. And down here we place the links sidebar below the header and against the left edge of the browser window. Its width is less than the main column margins to add space between the columns. On the next slide, you can see the news container defined right up here. We place the news sidebar below the header and against the right edge of the window. Its width is less than the main margins to add space between the columns. And finally, for the footer gets the same margin treatment as the main content column to make sure that the side columns don't overlap it. How about our result? Here's the result. Okay, one more example. This is a 3 columns with rules and padding between columns using the absolute positioning method and a fixed layout this time. In this 3 column layout example, all the 3 columns are absolutely positioned in a fixed layout. In addition, the borders and the padding have been added between the columns, and the values for left, that is the distance from the left edge of the containing block for all 3 content divs, the links, the main, and the news, are relative to the left edge of their div. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at this next note here. Whenever you add the padding, the margins, or the borders to a fixed width layout structure, it is important that the sum of the element widths plus all their extras do not exceed the total container width. Okay, in this example, we're looking at a 750 pixel overall width is divided into 2 150 pixel sidebars and a 450 pixel main column. Although it may be tempting to set the width of each div to these values, unfortunately this will not work. The width property applies only to the content area. Okay, so this figure that you're seeing here now breaks down all the measurements that span the width of the container div. The usual markup, because this is a fixed width layout, all of the content has been wrapped in a container div, and all 3 content containing div elements are absolutely positioned so that the main content div can appear first in the HTML document. Let's take a look at the style sheet. The container div that you're seeing has a fixed width of 750 pixels, and this time its position is set to relative. It is relative to establish it as a containing block for the absolute positioned column elements. Now the header has a height of 100 pixels. It's 70 plus the 2 paddings, the 2 sets of paddings. And all 3 content divs, the links, the main, and the news, are absolutely positioned below the header. There's your absolute positioning. The width of the main is 450 pixels minus the 2 pixels for the border, and 20 pixels of padding, which comes to a total of 428 pixels. We create solid vertical lines this time. Those are what the borders are used for. And we have 10 pixels of padding both on the left and the right. Okay. To wrap up this final example, the links part, the width of the links and the news is 150 pixels minus the 16 pixels total padding, 134, and we've got 8 pixels of padding both on the left and the right. And then for the news section, left is going to be set to 600 pixels, which is 450 plus the 150 and that leaves room for the first two columns. Okay. Quite a bit of information here. Let me just point out that everything we just saw in this third video really are just templates. These are examples of how we can use different setups using absolute positioning, relative positioning, fixed approaches, liquid approaches to create multi-columns web pages with multiple columns using CSS. It's one of the most basic type of setting up multi-column web pages. We are going to see in this class a couple more ways of doing that. I'm going to show you how you can use column numbers and column widths, and then also display grid and display flexbox. But these are certainly beyond the scope of today's lecture. So we wanted to just look at the established ways of creating multiple columns with CSS today. As the class progresses, I'm going to show you a few more ways of doing this that might seem a bit simpler than this. They're newer though. They use CSS3, so they require that the browsers support CSS3. Okay, and that's the end of today's lecture, the final third video. Thank you very much for watching.